There is a danger to the church today if we have the misleading view of eschatology or end times events in plain English. These wrong views can be dangerous as end time events unfold and the church is blind to what is happening. Let's discuss why the preterist theology is ill advised. How can anyone hold a preterist viewpoint after the rebirth of Israel as a nation? Please Google Miracle in Israel's War of Independence and also Miracles of the Six-Day War. God's modern intervention on behalf of Israel cannot be denied. There is an abundance of evidence from very reliable historical sources. The Bible repeatedly warns us, recognize the signs of the times. Preterists claim everything in the book of Revelation was fulfilled in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. The preterists have a serious history problem, not to mention a dangerous blindness to the events taking place in modern times. There is an excellent external evidence that the book of Revelation was not written until 95 AD. Irenaeus, who lived from 120 to 200 AD, spent his youth in Smyrna. Irenaeus is important to the dating of Revelation. Smyrna during this time is where Revelation circulated. More importantly, Irenaeus was the disciple of Polycarp, bishop of Smyrna, who was the disciple of John. We have someone who had direct contact with John's disciple, Polycarp. Irenaeus was intimately familiar with the writings and the timing of Revelation. Irenaeus states, "But if it had been necessary to announce his name plainly at the present time, it would have been spoken by him who saw the apocalypse. For it was not seen long ago, but almost in our own time, at the end of the reign of Domitian." This entire chapter, 530 of Against Heresies, is about the number of the beast, Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. So the context clearly speaks of the book of Revelation. Since Domitian was assassinated on September 18th, AD 96, this would date the book of Revelation around AD 95. None of the early Christian fathers believed that Irenaeus' statement was ambiguous. They all interpreted it to mean that John saw and wrote about his vision during the reign of Domitian. If Irenaeus is considered ambiguous, why didn't the early church fathers think so? The first person to suggest a reinterpretation of Irenaeus was John Jacob Wettstein in 1752. Not surprisingly, Wettstein was a preterist. Thus, no one before this time, for 1600 years, ever felt that Irenaeus' testimony was ambiguous until the system of preterism was invented. Irenaeus was very particular about his dating of Revelation. He did not only mention the reign of Domitian, but he mentions that John's vision occurred at the end of Domitian's reign. Hitchcock writes, "The specific dating of Revelation suggests that Irenaeus possessed special, intimate knowledge of the timing and conditions under which Revelation was written." Tertullian, AD 150 to 212, referred to by the Church Fathers. We do not have Tertullian's original writing about the dating of Revelation. However, both Jerome and Eusebius interpreted Tertullian to be dating the book under Domitian. Dio Cassius, AD 155 to 235. In his work, Roman History, Dio Cassius confirms that the fact that Domitian was in the practice of banishing prisoners to islands, while Dio does not specifically mention John's banishment during the reign of Domitian, he does refer 3 times to Domitian's practice of banishment. Dio even notes the release of exiles immediately after Domitian's death. The secular testimony solidly corroborates the ecclesiastical tradition of John's banishment under Domitian and liberation when Domitian died. Victorinus, AD 304. Victorinus wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, and his commentary is, in fact, the oldest commentary that we possess. In it, he writes, When John said these things, he was in the island of Patmos, condemned to the labor of the mines. There he saw the apocalypse, and when grown old, he thought that he should at length receive his acquittance by suffering. Domitian being killed, all his judgments were discharged, and John being dismissed from the mines, thus subsequently delivered the same apocalypse which he had received from God. Eusebius, A.D. 260 to 340. Eusebius writes, if it were necessary that the Antichrist's name should be declared clearly at the present time, it would have been announced by him who saw the revelation. For it was seen, not long ago, but almost in our generation, toward the end of the reign of Domitian. He states these things concerning the apocalypse in the work referred to. Internal evidence. Internal evidences are those which come from within the book itself. In addition to extra-biblical arguments, there are several internal evidences for the late date of Revelation. Argument number 1. John's ministry in Ephesus would overlap with Paul and Timothy. If the early date is true, then John would have been leading in Ephesus at the same time as Paul and Timothy. Why would Paul leave Timothy in charge of his church if the Apostle John was there? Moreover, at the end of 2 Timothy, Paul mentions 17 co-workers by name, but John isn't mentioned. Why wouldn't he mention John? Why wouldn't John mention Paul or Timothy in his writing to the church of Ephesus, Revelation 2, 1 through 7? Argument number 2. The church of Smyrna didn't exist in the 60s AD. Polycarp, writing in AD 110, states that Samaritans weren't believers during the time of Paul. Thus, how could John write to a church that didn't exist yet? While Acts 19, verse 10, says that all who lived in Asia heard the word of the Lord. This doesn't mean that a substantial church existed yet. Moreover, Paul never mentions a church existing in Smyrna in any of his letters, which is a conspicuous silence. Argument number 3. Paul writes of the church in Laodicea. We date the book of Colossians to AD 60 through 61. Paul mentions a thriving church in Laodicea at this time. Colossians 2, 4, 13, and 16. However, if Revelation was written in AD 65, then this church must have plummeted spiritually in just a few years. In fact, they had become so bad that Christ threatened to vomit them out of his mouth. Revelations 3:16. Of course, spiritual decline can occur quickly. Galatians 1:6. But which is more likely, a quick decline or a slower decline? Argument number 4. Laodicea suffered a massive earthquake in AD 60. Tacitus mentions that the Laodiceans refused all aid from the Roman Empire. 20. By the time that Revelation was written, Laodicea was completely rebuilt. This would make sense of John's comments that they have need of nothing. Revelations 3:16. This fits better with the AD 95 date. The archaeological evidence at Laodicea points to a 30-year rebuilding process. Collenhammer uses extensive historical research and modern-day archaeological discoveries to support this conclusion. Argument number 5. John's banishment to Patmos. John tells us that he was banished to Patmos, Revelations 1:9. Does this fit better with the early date or the late date? While Nero did practice banishment, he executed Peter and Paul rather than banishing them. Nero never banishes Christians, but Domitian is said to have banished another believer, Flavia Domitilla. She was banished in AD 95 to the island of Pandateria. She was also released by Nerva, the same as John. Craig Bloomberg writes, John's brief exile on the island of Patmos, 1:9, fits the mid-90s well, whereas there is no evidence of Christians being banished from their homelands by the government prior to this date. About the mention of the temple in Revelation 11, John speaks about the existence of the Jewish temple in his book, Revelation 11, 1 through 2. Preterist interpreters argue that John had no knowledge of the destruction of the Jewish temple, which occurred in AD 70. For this reason, they argue, this book must have been written before AD 70. First, John claims to be writing prophecy, not history. In Revelation 1:3, John says that his book is a work of prophecy. The repeated expression, "and I saw," occurs 44 times throughout the book. For John to write about the past destruction of the temple would be out of line with the genre of the book. Moreover, Jesus explicitly commands John, "Therefore, write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things." Revelation 1:19. If John decided to write about the past, then he would have been disobeying Jesus' command here. Second, Ezekiel wrote of a future temple that wasn't in existence when he wrote. In Ezekiel 40 through 42, the prophet sees a vision of an angel measuring the temple of God. However, when Ezekiel wrote this, no temple existed. Similarly, John saw an angel measure the temple, but this was a future temple that wasn't in existence yet. Third, Daniel wrote of a future temple that wasn't in existence when he wrote, in Daniel 9:24 through 27. The prophet wrote of a future temple that would be destroyed by the people of the prince who is to come. However, when Daniel wrote this, no temple existed. How is this any different than John writing of a future temple? Why didn't John mention the destruction of Jerusalem? Preterists argued that it is bizarre that John would fail to mention the destruction of Jerusalem. If he was writing in AD 95, Jesus' prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem was an excellent apologetic for supporting the veracity of Christ's claim. Preterists argue that John would fail to point this out in his letter. However, a number of counterarguments can be made. First, the original audience was ethnically and geographically different than Jerusalem. When we look at the churches in Revelation 2 and 3, these are all Gentile churches, not Jewish believers. They were 800 miles from Jerusalem. Second, the original audience was chronographically different than Jerusalem. If the late date is true, then the destruction of Jerusalem would have been 25 years in the past. Third, John was commanded to write about prophecy, Revelation 1:3, not apologetics. In Revelation 1:19, Jesus commands John, "Therefore write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things." John was a prophet who was writing about the future, not a historian or an apologist who was writing about the past. If Revelation was an apologetics text, we might expect him to mention this fulfilled prophecy. However, Revelation is a book of prophecy, not apologetics or history. Sources will be found in this video's description.